Get started with our next panel. As at least in my mini micro bubble, a lot of people are very excited about this conversation. So my name is Andrea Leiter. I am one of the co-founders of Sovereign Nature Initiative, and I direct the research at SNI. And it is my great pleasure to be the moderator and host for this panel today, which has the somewhat provocative title, Earthy Web3, a discussion on token economics and conservation. And I think, as already in the panels before, there is a lingering question of what is the potential of Web3? What does crypto do? Is this some greenwashing? Where are we taking this? What is the potential? What are the dangers? What are we up to here? So really, this is the hard question of this panel, and we have three speakers to speak to this. So let's say, when we discuss that, when we propose Web3 technologies for conservation or as a response to climate change, some think it's a fantastic idea and others think it's a nightmare. Some people associate this intersection with the great potential of revaluing nature to acknowledge the centrality of the living ecosystem planet Earth. Others hear the latest attempt at a further commodification of natural resources to advance the ongoing extraction and exploitation, now under the framework of a new token economy. What can be said for sure is that the intersection of technology and ecology is one of the most important sites of engagement, and that an open conversation with participants from different perspectives is essential for anyone interested in this field. So in this conversation, we discuss the potential, promises, pitfalls, and limitations of Web3 technologies in ecology and conservation from different perspectives. Trent McConaghy is one of the first visionaries of Nature 2.0 and a strong supporter of technological innovation for ecological purposes, if that is a fair characterization. Andrea here is a community builder in the token engineering world, and engages with token economics for global coordination problems. Fletcher here, the co-author of the book Conservation Revolution, is an expert on contemporary approaches to conservation from the perspective of political ecology. Together, we want to discuss the approaches and understandings of Web3 technologies, not only for conservation efforts. Okay, so what we will do is that we will have brief presentations by all three speakers, and we'll then pretty quickly go into an open conversation, because precisely this idea of having different perspectives challenge each other is what we have here. And just on a very personal note, I know all of the three speakers personally, and I think that they are some of the most open-minded, generous, and yet sharp and smart thinkers. So I'm really excited for this. We'll start with Trent. I think the slides are up. Okay, Trent, the floor is yours.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Great. Cool. So I will keep these slides short, and I'm going to talk about things I don't often talk about. I won't talk about ocean or token engineering or anything like that right here. Instead, I'm putting on my engineer hat and saying, if there was an objective function for the problem we were to solve around climate change, many have casted it as the following: simply, there are 51 billion tons of CO2 going to the air every year, and we needed that to get that to zero. Bill Gates had that in his book, others have framed it. There's other objective functions too, but I'm just treating that one here. So that's the name of the game, to get this thing to zero. Next slide. And we have the technology, a lot of technologies to solve it, right? Bill Gates in his book wrote out, there's lots of things there, but everything from hydroelectric to soil, carbon capture, lots and lots of technologies. No problem, right? Of course, these all cost money, and I'll get to that. Next slide. And then on the other side, what is being done? Well, things like Paris Accord, where world leaders in Paris agreed to his historic deal on climate change. And this is a couple of world leaders, of course, hugging. Next. I'm going to pause for a second on climate and just give you a 1-minute Cookie Monster explanation of supply and demand. If the price of cookies decreases, then demand for milk increases. So this is a simple description of what's going on in the world of supply and demand of markets. Next slide. This is a summary of how I see the world of solving this problem of CO2 reduction. On the left side, we've got trillions of dollars worth of technology ready to go to solve this problem. Everything from carbon capture to all the ideas being talked about here and many other places. And on the right side, we have hugs. Trillions versus hugs. And guess what? This Paris Climate Accord was 7 years ago. Those hugs did not lead to a balanced market. Next slide. One does not simply ignore the law of supply and demand and then act surprised by the results. We should not be surprised by where we are today. Next slide. But I'm a builder. I'm not a complainer. If I'm going to complain, I'm going to come up with questions of how to go forward. And ideas too, but I'm going to hold back from the ideas here and simply end my talk with, to me, perhaps the most important question. The most pragmatic question. How do we create a demand side for the market of CO2 reduction? We've got trillions of dollars ready to deploy. We can't live in a fantasy land and pretend that capitalism doesn't exist. How do we get trillions of dollars worth of demand to solve this problem? That's it, thanks.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'm Angela. I founded the TokenEngineering Academy. Now, how is this related to what Trent just talked about? Solving supply and demand for sustainability, for CO2 emissions. This is about redefining our economic systems. Now, we have been talking about crypto the entire day. You saw presentations. We're talking about NFTs. This is about designing new economic systems via token-based economic systems. Go to the next slide. And token engineering is basically this new discipline for designing, validating, and optimizing these new systems. Go to the next slide. It's a combination of existing disciplines, but basically token engineering it was first mentioned 2018. It's the youngest engineering discipline after software engineering was established in the 1960s. It combines, step back, can you go back? Yeah. It combines computer science, cryptography, obviously, we are talking about crypto systems, blockchain, and economic scale theory. We have operations, research, management, science, because we are creating new networks and can analyze these networks. We can apply systems engineering for applying the methods there in simulations, stress testing, balancing control theory, and we have granular data to an extent we never had before. We have data about pretty much every single economic transaction, and we can analyze this data, build controllers, we can apply AI. And of course, at the lower end of this image, the social side. It's not about mechanical engineering, no. We have socio-technical systems. We are talking about human behavior, decision-making, political science and governance of these systems. And these are the fields that are relevant for token engineering. If you go to the next slide, our mission at TE Academy is developing this new engineering discipline to educate token engineers and also to create new value flows for our own economy, education and research. Go to the next. Some words about our students. We started in 2020, since then had more than 1,000 participants, and now for the latest program, that is the first program to study token engineering, more than 1,000 sign-ups in 8 weeks. All courses are free for students and available online, and our students come from all across the world, all backgrounds, and are willing to take their local night hours for our online courses. So we see that there's really a huge enthusiasm on, we have to somehow get the economics right on our planet. Next slide. Some images of our courses, and you can study this. There's a new program being live in September. And next slide. Yeah, and why I'm here. Saving the planet with token-based economies. So this is pretty bold, no? And if you think about this, oh, blockchain, crypto kids getting rich, scam, token launches, this is probably not the first thing you would associate crypto with. But I say you can save the planet with token-based economies. Let's take a closer look. Change, you've heard it many times. If we don't get the economic incentives right on this planet, there won't be any change. If it's profitable to ruin the planet, we won't be safe. But we can redefine incentives in a much smarter way. And there's the opportunity to do that with tokens, and we'll get to that. Then the key paradigm of blockchain is that we create digital infrastructure that is a public good. So imagine Google, super important for all our lives in many dimensions, but it's a private company. Blockchains are public goods, are governed by stakeholders, and we apply processes, decision-making, like more on a nation-state democratic way. So governing digital infrastructure in a democratic way beyond nation-states on a global scale. This is the second element. And the last element, align incentives, global coordination. For global change, we need global coordination. However, we often hear, oh, people don't really care about sustainability, so they prioritize personal convenience over sustainability, protecting nature, and so on. I don't think that's true. We know that people care about their close environment, about their resources they have access to and they depend on. And we can use the global or we can build on the local care for your resources and nature and scale up with global coordinations via tokens. And this is a very important element if we think about, okay, there must be an element of individual gain, and at the same time, this global approach, global coordination towards, for example, protecting nature or reducing CO2 emissions. These three elements, I'm sure we dig deeper, change, get the economic incentives right, digital infrastructure as a public good, and aligning incentives on a global scale is something that we see in token-based economies.
I'm happy to be here with you today. My name is Rob Fletcher. I'm a researcher at Wageningen University. I'm getting close to being able to say that name right after 8 years here. I know very little about tech, but I'm part of a research network that's been looking at conservation policy and practice on the ground and in global discussions in various parts of the world over the last 20 years. And out of that discussion, next slide, emerged this book, co-authored by my colleague at Wageningen, Bram Buscher. He wasn't able to be here today, but I'm representing both of us in this discussion. And this is our attempt to kind of build on some of the research that's been done and suggest what we think is a productive way for conservation to move forward, both in global discussions and on-the-ground policy. Next slide. And so what we have our sights on is this ongoing discussion about the future of global biodiversity policy. It's been going on for the last 2 years. It was supposed to be decided in 2020, but it's been continually postponed due to the pandemic. But it's basically going to shape global responses, but also how these responses translate into practice all around the world. It's ongoing. And we've been studying the process leading up to it and seeing that the current discussion is dominated by two kind of very powerful coalitions with very different approaches thinking about how conservation should function. Next slide. So the first is a group that promotes a very traditional approach to doing conservation based in the enforcement and protection of protected areas. But they become very ambitious in their proposal, arguing that these should be connected and expanded to potentially encompass about half of the Earth's surface. It goes under kind of rubrics like the Half-Earth Project, which is associated with E.O. Wilson, a celebrity biologist at Harvard who recently passed away, but also the Nature Needs Half Project. Right? They become very influential in terms of promoting their perspective as the basis for conservation policy. Okay? On the other hand, there's another coalition that promotes a completely opposite approach. Right? So they advocate is moving away from strict protected areas, trying to find spaces that integrate humans and non-humans, but to base conservation policy on economic valuation. Right? Essentially trying to make the business case for biodiversity protection to move forward. Valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services. One of the largest, most influential groups involved in this is called the Capitals Coalition. It's a consortium that contains most of the large environmental conservation organizations, Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, international organizations like UNEP, UNDP, the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, and then also the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a collection of 200 of the most powerful corporations all around the world. They've become quite influential as well in promoting economic valuation as the basis for conservation policy moving forward. Next slide. And so on the ground, we've seen kind of these different approaches being played out in the intensification of practices on the ground in different places, right? On the one hand, in a lot of places, to protect endangered wildlife, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen an increasing use of military personnel and forces to protect remaining biodiversity. On the other hand, kind of a proliferation of what are called market-based mechanisms for conservation, things like ecotourism, payment for environmental services, the REDD+, reduced emissions through avoided deforestation and land degradation mechanism, biodiversity banking, wetlands banking, carbon markets, a variety of these other kind of mechanisms as well. Okay? Next slide. And these things have significant consequences. Right? Environmental consequences in the sense that it's become widely recognized that a lot of these things aren't really doing the job in terms of conserving the biodiversity that's needed on a global scale. And they also have significant social consequences. Militarization in terms of the increasing abuse and often killing of suspected poachers. On the other hand, market mechanisms in terms of enclosing resources that are often needed and used in the past by indigenous and other local communities. Right? All of these kind of consequences of these different approaches are important and concerning to us, and question whether or not either of these approaches is really the productive basis for thinking about conservation policy moving forward. Next slide. On the other hand, you have a variety of different kind of conservation practices being played out on the ground by indigenous and other communities and organizations that represent them in various places. The Indigenous and Community Conservation Areas Coalition, the Forest Peoples Program, Survival has a campaign on decolonizing conservation. Okay? A variety of different approaches. One of the issues that we see is these approaches are often quite disparate. Right? Spearheaded by different organizations employing different language, and they haven't been able to kind of come together in the same type of coalition with the same type of political power to influence the agenda in the same way as some of these others. Okay? But through conversations with various people, we've been able to suggest that there's kind of a core set of principles that a lot of these approaches share that we think will be a more productive basis for conservation policy moving forward. Right? So what we're imagining is the potential to move from this kind of half-Earth approach, right, strictly separating humans from nature, right, toward more of a whole Earth, or what we call a convivial conservation approach. And this would have these 5 central principles at the center of things. Next slide. Okay. The idea would be first moving away from strictly enforced protected areas, separating people from nature, and instead promoting integrated landscapes, right, that don't do this. And we're seeing this actually play out in a lot of places, especially in terms of indigenous territories in various places. The second is thinking in terms of governance arrangements and moving away from top-down control towards more democratic and equitable, and especially gender-sensitive governance arrangements. And the third has to do with financing mechanisms. And in this case, we're advocating is a move away from trying to engage with the market as the basis for conservation financing and trying to move towards more non-market redistributive funding methods that move the wealth that we already have into the hands of people living in conservation critical areas. Okay? And the fourth is then moving away from economic valuation as the main basis for conservation thinking, and instead promoting valuation based on the intrinsic and spiritual significance of resources to the people who are living in close connection with these resources on the ground. And the final is in terms of the forms of knowledge that are privileged in conservation decision making, moving away from a strict reliance on kind of Western science as the main basis for decision making, and having conversations between diverse forms of knowledge and way of knowing enacted by the people who are living in these conservation spaces. So it's these kind of 5 principles that we see as kind of common to this disparate series of approaches that go under a variety of labels. We're calling this convivial conservation. But in addition to thinking about what happens in these concrete spaces, in our proposal we think an equally important aspect of this is, next slide, turning our backs away from these areas and looking at the role of global political economic systems and the pressures they exert on the spaces of conservation on the ground, and being able to address these as well to create more autonomous spaces for people to practice conservation in this convivial way in local spaces. And this means in particular challenging consumption practices of the wealthiest segments of our population, and really kind of challenging this really consumption-based practices of high-income populations, even if they live far from these concrete conservation spaces. Okay? So all of this together, we're calling this label of convivial conservation, and hoping that through the coalitions that we've developed with various organizations that are practicing in this way, and through others in conversations like we're having here, to help create more influence in terms of global policy and practice moving forward. Last slide. To thank you very much, I direct you to this website where we have a lot of resources, and also to the book, which contains a lot more kind of explanation of these policy and principles than I'm able to communicate in this short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it on? Hello? Now? Super. Okay, so I would really just first want to say thank you very much. All very crisp and sharp and straightforward presentations. My first question would be to say I think that all of us would see particular convergences, particular divergences, but I would like to not set up any of them specifically, but really like to ask you to pick and choose where you would like to maybe go off from what you heard. How do you see that relate to each other? Where do you want to take this from? And then we can maybe dig a little deeper and get a little harder. But let's open up with what resonated. Where do you want to start with? And do you want to start, Angela? Yeah. Okay. Cool.
I guess we are all on the same page when it comes to this local perspective on our resources, and also a local management and governance from those who are most affected. On the other hand, I see a divergence, obviously, in this how to get to that point. And I would say, in crypto world, I would say we don't try to avoid to get around the economic part. We rather try to embrace it, and I would even say hijack it for progress. And that's probably the difference I see.
So I actually see these, I think what Angela described as a tool that can be used to help solve this 51 billion ton CO2 problem. And what I see you presented as well is another tool to help this, right? And then what I presented is basically the problem to solve, and it's a different description than before, right? So the traditional description is 51 billion tons, and there's all this supply, but no one is treating it as a market problem, right? Where does this demand come from? So Angela's tools help to show that you can have some demand by great token engineering. And I think your description is saying we can also shift around some of the demand by also going bottom up, but with non-market mechanisms and other approaches. Overall, this is, I think, all really promising. And to me, the big question is any of it big enough, right? Can we get this big enough? Because, and how much does it actually cost, right? And there's different back-of-the-envelope calculations, right? You know, there's a famous sci-fi writer, Neil Stephenson, just wrote a book recently called Termination Shock. And in it, this Texas billionaire takes $15 million worth of sulfur and puts it into the air, right? And that's, apparently it's backed by real data and stuff, right? And that's enough to buy 5 years of time for basically the sulfur, then the sun reflects off the sulfur and doesn't heat the planet, so you buy 5 years, right? And overall, that's just the cost of the sulfur, so maybe you could spend a couple $100 million to solve this. So that total cost is only, say, $200–300 million, right? Yet, and there's other ideas that cost maybe $1 billion, $100 billion, whatever dollars, right? You can have space-based mirrors, you can refreeze the Arctic. There's quite a few different approaches, right? And the biggest reluctance I hear is simply people saying, well, you know, we don't want geoengineering, even though we right now are doing geoengineering and it's just bad for us, right? The lithium mines and the tar sands and all of this. So to me, it's a market question, but it's also a game theory question, right? There is not real political will. And I mean, I'd love to hear actually from you on this too, simply because a lot of what you write about and talk about is the politics of it, the geopolitics. So we seem to have this big game theory problem. I think both of you have insights into how we might crack that, right? In the book, this Texas billionaire just does it, right? And that's the way to puncture it, but maybe there's other approaches too.
What I've seen in my experience in the research, looking at attempts to create markets, for trade in environmental services, natural capital, also carbon markets to try to deal with this demand side question over the last 30 years, has been a real difficulty in terms of establishing them on a substantial basis to generate the kind of demand that's in question, right? A lot of this is kind of, been down to the lack of political will to put these things into place. But I think there's a more fundamental problem, right? And the fundamental problem is the fact that the activities that we're trying to counter, fossil fuel extraction, mineral extraction, are incredibly lucrative, right? They're the basis for our global economy. They provide, a substantial component of our GDP. And it's very, very difficult to create that same type of revenue through non-consumption, right? Through non-use of resources. And I don't really see the mechanism for being able to do so. A lot of these markets, the attempt is to try to kind of link up supply and demand through offsetting, right? But that means that in order to have more kind of conservation or non-use, you actually have to have more extraction, right? In order to be able to offset it. At the same time, what you want in your kind of conservation markets is to also then internalize the social and environmental costs, to be able to offset the fact that it's primarily those externalities that are responsible for a lot of the profit that's generated in conventional markets, right? So not only do you need to be able to generate more revenue than extractive markets, but you need to also be able to do that in such a way that it also then provides a social and environmental dividend for those communities. And I haven't really seen any kind of mechanism that's really been able to kind of crack that nut. And as a result, what we've seen in some of these major so-called market-based mechanisms is over time, as they've had a very large difficulty creating actual kind of market demand, what they've done is kind of transition from more market mechanisms to state-led mechanisms where states have to come in to, in a sense, kind of provide the demand in a sense that markets aren't able to provide. And so what often we see in payment for environmental services programs, in the REDD+ mechanism, is they become in a sense kind of de facto subsidies over time. Right? And so I see this as the way forward, is actually building on the logic of what's happening in terms of conservation financing and actually using that to scale up the, centralized to a certain extent, or decentralized if we can somehow mobilize the technology to facilitate it, but to be able to appropriate those resources and redistribute them without any expectation of kind of profit or gain, because I just don't see where where that profit exists.
Oh yeah, I really like how you frame that, and how it's basically there have been market mechanisms tried in the past, but they're more small scale, and eventually governments need to take over. You know, carbon credits. You know, everyone cheers when there's a total of $1 billion. I think the number now is about $1 billion worth of carbon credits in the world. Yeah, we've got hundreds of billions of trillions of dollars worth of like that's a fraction of what we need from supply side, right? Sorry, from the demand side. But there's some interesting numbers out there, like, here's one for you. The value of all the real estate in South Beach, Miami is $680 billion. In 50 years, it's all underwater. In fact, possibly 30 years, there's actually flooding now. Flood insurance, private flood insurance in all of Florida is impossible to get, because the insurers see that. So then you can ask, how can you pull that $680 billion of the value from the future to now? This is a financial engineering question. Well, the mayor of Miami doesn't want to tell you this, and the developers neither. When you go to buy a condo in Miami, they say, we follow regulations. But if you ask them, what about, Miami going underwater? They say, oh, don't worry about that, we follow regulations. And they don't care. In fact, the guy who develops 2/3 of the real estate in Miami, an author of a book called The Water Will Come, this author asks him, what are you doing about it? He says, I don't know, I don't care, I'm going to be dead then. He's 7 years old. So he's not caring about the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, right? To quote Charlie Munger, show me the incentives and I will show you the outcome. This guy is not incentivized to solve the problem, right? But $680 billion, this is a pretty big number, and this is just Miami. What about New York City? What about Vancouver and Seattle? What about Venice? What about half of Bangladesh? What about most of Netherlands, right? Netherlands has the talent to fix this, but it's going to probably go broke doing it right now. So what can be done, right? So overall, this is where I see if Miami and all these other 50 cities that will be underwater in 50 years had a means to globally coordinate, what then? Maybe the most economic way then is to actually solve the problem.
And in this sense, I'd like to promote a little bit different view on markets. Of course, this term is so spoiled, and it's tied to speculation, it's tied to globalization, and all the negative effects and developments we want to overcome. But at the same time, markets are the most flexible, dynamic instrument to cause reactions. And if we look at, you said, we are complying to regulation. What we see over the last couple of years, be it COVID, be it climate crisis, be it the war in Ukraine, we have to be really fast. And obviously, we continuously wait too long. So how can we rely on something else than a tool that provides speed for changing behaviors? And markets are such a tool. And this is what I like to look different on markets, because it can help us to be fast, and we will have to be fast. And then it's, for me, rather, you're right, a problem of how to account for negative externalities, how to really define the value and cause this supply and demand market reactions.
Rob, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'd be very interested to hear from the two of you, because I do agree in the sense that, and it's really possible to show the damage that's caused by not actually incorporating, these values into the market all the time in all kinds of different ways, and the substantial costs that will result if we don't deal with things on the ground now. I mean, there's a large effort to kind of value ecosystem services around the world to demonstrate exactly that. But then the next step of actually creating markets that compensate for that, that's the key question. And so the big question within that is, where does the financing come from? Where does the money actually come from that then allows these kind of non-consumptive markets than to function as an antidote to the destructive markets, and that's what I'm really interested to hear.
$680 billion worth of Miami real estate. How do we pull the value of that going poof from the future to the now? Well, guess what? People have 30-year mortgages. But right now, when they go to put down that 30-year mortgage, they're sticking their head in the sand. The sand that's flooding. Last year, Miami real estate went up 40%, despite when you walk down the streets of Miami, there's flooding on the streets. They have to pump it out every single day. So it's actually partly an awareness thing here, right? And that to me, like real estate is, one of the biggest industries in the world, right? And that's, $680 billion in just one place. So that to me is a pretty awesome source of demand. And you do your financial engineering to pull the future to the now simply with mortgages. And then around that, you can wrap incentives, you can globally coordinate, etc. Do this in, the 50 most vulnerable cities. We've got a market.
I would very much like to actually open the floor already, because I think we have a lot of people in the audience who have thought about many of these things, who are very interested in these topics, and I think we have already had a very strong start here, so I think it would be really cool to hear what are the questions that are from the audience, and really let you respond to them in the best way. So raise your hands for questions, or much rather even, maybe could you do the effort of walking up here and take the mic and say it loud, because I know I've been in the audience before and it's very hard to hear if someone speaks. It's not so easy. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks very much. Thanks for the talks. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on experiments such as the one that was recently done by KlimaDAO and Toucan, where they were trying to raise the price of carbon using kind of like Web3 and crypto models. I think it's a really interesting experiment. I'd love to hear from you on your thoughts on that.
I guess I can describe for everyone in the room. There's basically some token engineering mechanisms to, a DAO is basically a wallet, and a bunch of people can collectively hold value in that wallet, right? So KlimaDAO was trying to buy some of these carbon credits. I think the challenge there is that fundamentally, these carbon credits, the total value of all carbon credits is in the world is, I don't know, $1 billion, right? And it's all basically coming from government spending money for that, right? So a government in a country that has, say, $1 trillion worth of energy being spent here, that country is maybe spending, 100 million max, so at like 0.1%. And there is zero political will, and from what I can tell, to actually increase that to anything substantial, where, could you make it 100 billion a year? A trillion? I don't think so. So I think it's cool what KlimaDAO is doing to raise awareness, but ultimately carbon credits as they currently are is won't cut it, right? It's 0.1% of the solution. It's not a real mechanism. I would love to hear ways to turn it into a real mechanism, but I haven't heard them so far.
Yeah, come on.
Thanks for all the input. I've got one question and one mind thing. I'm not sure if it leads to a question. So I'm wondering, Trent, you just said it's an awareness thing. So we obviously have a problem with the old thinking of, okay, what is growth, what is success, what is performance in our meritocracy. And we've got a system that is still in some way working. So I'm wondering, this mindset change, this change of how to look at things, this perspective thing, it just takes way too long. So maybe not. I mean, we're pulling on different sides, so maybe it's working out. So I'm wondering what we can do, maybe with narratives, maybe with with education or something like that, and also how. That's a question. How, like, using the mechanisms of markets, I'm wondering if we could change supply demand into actually needs, and not only human-based needs, but non-human-based needs. and kind of like, okay, what we could provide if that could be some kind of different one.
So here, I think when it comes to any incentive design, it's worth taking a look at, again, at this local level. The individual as being directly affected, and where's the need, and where can we grow demand in a sense. So there's a very good example currently in Berlin, Brandenburg, where I'm coming from. We have huge problems with aridity. So it hasn't rained since 12 weeks, I guess. This is totally unusual. And but still, nobody's panicking, right? Even you go through the streets of Berlin and trees are dropping their leaves in springtime. So it's just what's going on and no reaction. Here's another aspect. Due to this lack of water, some communities announced that garden owners can't water their plants anymore. So it's forbidden to water your plants. And we have these Schrebergärten, and I think they are called Volkstuintje in Dutch, right? People love their Volkstuintjes, and they fight it all the real estate. It can't be sold. It really matters. Now you can't water it anymore. You can sit in your garden and watch your trees and your plants die. This really does matter. Now, of course, that we are at the next level of incentive design. Imagine you are these Volkstuintjes are always in larger spots, so if you have smaller portions, you can watch your neighbor. Tragedy of the commons. Would you stop watering your plants if your neighbor doesn't, right? So that wouldn't work. So how to enforce policies like that? How to enforce water management? And now this is an urgent problem. And there's literally, I don't see any way how we can implement this and enforce it with our current mechanisms, with just banning it. Or you can't drink water anymore. So that's a real problem. Now, this promise of having these digital infrastructures allow you to implement mechanisms in a easier, faster way, so that you can imagine you tie it to your water consumptions. You are still free to consume water for your plants or to take less showers, whatever. But we can implement new mechanisms to incentivize savings, and not only for the individual, but scale up and aggregate it across communities, and then have a better water management. So these are the mechanisms I see. Go from a very local level, addressing very local problems that really matter to people, and then draw your learnings for your incentive mechanisms. Use digital infrastructure to implement them, to make it a fair thing for everybody, because otherwise you have the tragedy of the commons. And this is what I'm talking about with token-based economies, to give an example. Rob, you wanna?
I think this question of awareness is interesting and crucial, and that's often one of the key components in these efforts to value natural capital and ecosystem services, with the idea that if companies become aware of all of the damages that they're externalizing, right, in terms of the economic value that's being caused, then they'll be able to reverse it. And we're a bit suspicious of that, right? Because we suspect that a lot of companies are actually quite aware of what they're externalizing, because it essentially is the source of their profit, right? And that they're also aware that if they actually internalize all of the things that are being externalized as the basis of profit, that essentially the markets will disappear. And so there's, I think, strong incentives to continue to externalize and to not really become deeply aware of what you're externalizing, right? And that's essentially, I think, how many markets function. I don't really see any alternative to that other than more taxation and regulation. And for me, I think that was needed to happen, because I just don't see markets as being able to solve these problems in and of themselves.
Maybe can I add one more layer to this question, because I think that we are now on a convergence on the point of there is some kind of idea of a common goal, that even though it is locally based, the assumption is that we know what it is, and then the question is how do we build a market that does that. But maybe just to back one step before that, how is this definition coming together of what it is that is the good thing? I mean, CO2, carbon sequestration, okay, but then what is the cost of that? How does that relate to biodiversity? How does that relate to other things? And then if you take that really seriously, and I think in the panel before there was a question of a participant from the Global South saying, well, for me, this looks very different. I have a very different perspective on this. So it's a bit of a question of really in a open framework of there are maybe certain layers where a market mechanism works in certain ways. The question would be, what are the limitations in your proposition of a convivial mode? What is the non-market-based part? How does that come into that? How do we bring that in? What does it mean to have knowledge production from below that goes into that? Can token engineering go all the way down to that? How do we do that? So the step before the market.
So I think actually what you propose is the long-term solution, right? But it's the sort of thing that takes probably a generation or two to arrive at, right? Maybe not. I mean, Amsterdam went from cars to bikes in what, 5 years? So maybe there's ways city by city, but at least over the span of 1 or 2 generations, certainly. But is it fast enough to help the planet in the next 10 years, 20 years, right? Or are we going to end up with 3 meter water level rise, right? So to me, we need to. It's really helpful if we can buy time for humanity so that we don't end up with desert everywhere and floods everywhere, right? I want to just have a brief answer to the question of raising awareness. I think obviously raising awareness overall is useful, shining light on everything. But I was actually very specific. It's really important to raise awareness to the people that are looking at buying a condo in Miami, or even here, right? If you know that Amsterdam is underwater in 40 years, how do you feel about your mortgage right now, right? And that's a real question to Ceuvel, right? There's the goal to have this for the next 200 years. But does it matter if it's underwater in 40 years? And what are you going to do about it, right? And so it becomes very local very quickly. And then, you know what? Guess what? This isn't just a problem for De Ceuvel in Amsterdam. This is a problem for Miami and for Venice, etc. So how do you globally coordinate with all these other communities as well who have the same problem?
And I would like to add, we have a community that is all across the globe. We've realized that our view in Europe on preserving nature is so different from somebody in Brazil and in Africa. And I think this is also a very political question. So it's not only about the market mechanisms, it's about our perspective on and priorities. But I don't see any way around acknowledging that communities all across the world have a right to say what should happen with their direct environment, whatever they might choose. And then it's rather about education on the problems, of course, education on their perspectives, the time. But still, I think we be it with markets or anything else, imposing a certain solution, that's not the way to go.
Okay, so I would suggest we will go with one last round of questions. So if you could come up if you have a question, and we will take them all at once because we're really running time, but I would like to hear all the questions and then you choose how you respond to that, okay? Please come on up here, you can start, and everyone else who has a question, come up.
Thank you.
Everyone is rising up.
Okay, it appears there seems to be some kind of consensus that carbon credits don't really work that well at the moment and probably won't work in the near future. And then you state that the tokenization economy and the blockchain and things like that, they offer additional incentives for people to act sustainably, right? But to me, it's still a little bit vague. Like, what exactly are those incentivization structures? If we, for instance, take the example of the water, right? we don't spray water. How does it really work? Perhaps I wasn't there in the previous things, but how does it concretely work?
Yeah, kind of the same, because I feel like you can indeed have these financial mechanisms to bring it forward to the present and all those different things. But I'm like, how does that really gonna motivate the change deep inside, or the change within the person to really tackle this problem? So I'm still trying to understand how this can really, like, at the core change just how we as humanity interact with nature. It's a bit of this theme of this festival, so this was kind of your perspective in it, because that's the part I'm missing. Like, then, but yeah, it's maybe a bit in line with the question. But, yeah.
I just heard Trent to say political will a few times in the answers that you gave. And since we're talking about Web3 and nature, at least the consensus that I see from the world as far as political will is concerned is that cryptocurrencies and blockchain is a no-go without most systemic organizations even understanding what it is for. So I think I'm also just curious to understand, where is the awareness in the political sphere for this, even before this could be shut down, no matter how big you make this experiment in most markets overnight. So that's also just something that I'm curious about.
If we know that the markets aren't accounting for the true cost of carbon, is there something we could do to hedge that and then collateralize it as a debt?
I understand your proposal as kind of distributed ledger technologies for managing the commons, which allows for your local kind of approach. But my question is, what about coordination? So if this works, if you assume that local, let's say cultural diverse communities can manage their own assets, their own resources through these technologies, what other layers would be necessary before this becomes global? So it's coordinating from the local to the scale that we need, to the 1 billion tons.
I think it's similar to the crypto, and also to this one. It's related to technology is very costly, and also energy, and also productive, manufacturing it. And how do we democratize it to everybody can access the technology that the only technology that we need, not to private companies that do whatever they want because they are paying for. But how do we democratize this to everybody to solve the right problems?
Thank you for coming. You were the first one in line. I didn't want to leave you go.
Two quick questions. The first one is there is a market failure. So standard economic theory says that you have to price the externalities. European Commission has now reformed the CO2 pricing, and it seems it's starting to work, because CO2 price is 70 euros a ton at the moment. So what's your thought on that question? And the second question I would like to pose is, I don't hear a lot about international solidarity with the developing world, and I think that there is one solution there. So perhaps the token economy can help, but we need more economic technology transfer to the developing world.
Thank you very much. Okay, super. So I would say we go, Angela, you start, we just go down the row and you pick and choose and go with what you want.
Okay, I try and answer on this. How does this work with these incentives? All right, here's a token, example for a token. It's a euro. And a token basically serves the function of a medium of exchange. You can buy something with your token, monetary value, as the first function. But it's programmable money, so we can program additional functions to it. So this could be also your decision-making right to decide on new functionalities of this token. What can I do with this token? Decision-making right as a second layer. And in itself, think of incentives not only in terms of I get money, I get revenue. An incentive can also be access, like access to decision-making. And actually, by the way, in crypto land, there are governance tokens to be considered as the most valuable asset. It's not about the value at the moment, the market price of a token just today. We have huge fluctuation. Actually, the most valuable asset is governance rights for these digital infrastructure. All right, one incentive, access to decision making. There's another layer possible that comes to imagine this token carries a piece of information. This information tells you that I've saved energy in the last month. And this way, this token is designed, the mechanism is designed in a way that it grows in value for me as the holder to pay for, let's say, carbon-free mobility. So we have a dynamic, programmable aspect here as well. And then we can aggregate to a community level in a sense that the aggregated, let's say, participation of all the tokens in our community to program to provide battery storage and local energy storage, green energy in batteries. The tokens who take part in this community are tied to the funds distribution to keep places like this alive. So there's another level of aggregation and then distribution of funds, for example, that we can implement with tokens. Just to give you some example of the programmable functions, the individual incentives, and then aggregations. Hope this helps.
Hi, I'm going to answer two questions. First is the political will, and second is specific market mechanisms. On political will, once again, it comes down to show me the incentives, I will show you the outcome. These days, a lot of politicians are simply there to make money. They're there to get reelected and to just make a career out of getting reelected, right? They are non-player characters. They are not live actors. They are blank faces. Not all of them. There's some really great exceptions, right? In any given country or any given government, city or otherwise, there's great exceptions. But it's become an exception to the rule. Compare that to reading about, the founding fathers of the United States or otherwise, right? And there's wonderful archetypes of people to follow. So to me, in the world of tokens and blockchain, a lot of the strategy has simply been to route around that, right? 4 years ago, the U.S. Senate started to take notice of Bitcoin and so on, and they realized that Bitcoin is unkillable, so they actually had to make policy assuming that Bitcoin is unkillable. It's never going to go away because there's always going to be 5 or 10 people, no matter what, even if it becomes illegal, there's always going to be enough people running it. And that's the case with all of this other public infrastructure too that's getting built, right? It's unkillable. So, and that's a really, really powerful, useful thing. Hopefully, governments will get on board. Hopefully there will be incentives. But it's actually become more and more of an assumption that maybe they won't, right? And you have to route around them. On the second part of what are potential market mechanisms, I've given hints in this before, but I'm going to pose a question to any of you. With each of you knowing what you know about climate change, who here is willing to bet their life savings on real estate being valuable here in Amsterdam in 50 years? Raise your hand. Enough said.
As I mentioned at the outset, I'm very new to these tech discussions, so I'm not sure if I have anything productive I can say in relation to this last set of questions. I'm just here to learn, so what do you would like to take up?
I'd like to answer on this. I guess it was your question on the accessibility. On one hand, I fully agree that the energy consumption of some of the blockchains we have on this planet is a nightmare. There are reasons for it. It's particularly the proof of work, consensus mechanisms in Bitcoin. this criticism at least led many other blockchains to think about their consensus mechanisms, to try to make it equally sure and secure via not consuming that much energy. And actually there are alternatives in proof-of-stake mechanisms. And so my message here is, it's good to criticize crypto. It helps to make progress, and the environmental aspect in fact matters, no question. On the other hand, having access, the nice thing, and that looking at our students from all across the world, the nice thing about it, that it's actually a space that you can enter like almost anything else on this planet. You can be part of a DAO, pretty much. It's all online, it's all remote. You dial into a call, you take a look at the tasks that where you can contribute, and then you go. It's good to criticize crypto. It helps to make progress, and the environmental aspect in fact matters, no question. On the other hand, having access, the nice thing, and that looking at our students from all across the world, the nice thing about it, that it's actually a space that you can enter like almost anything else on this planet. You can be part of a DAO, pretty much. It's all online, it's all remote. You dial into a call, you take a look at the tasks that where you can contribute, and then you go. You don't need certificates, you don't need to pay, you can be part of it.
Okay, so we have gone over time. I will just say thank you very much to our speakers here. I think I didn't overpromise when I said open-minded and generous and thinking together. I think that was a very nice exercise of that here. Thank you everyone for the questions, for listening, for joining. This is an open door. This is an ongoing conversation that we want to keep having. There are not all answers here yet, but just a lot of thought-provoking messages, statements and questions. So I think I would leave it at that and say we hope to continue this conversation with all of you. Thank you for coming.